In a week when a kangaroo stole the World Cup and we learned that China may be having second thoughts about the North Koreans, we welcome our newsmakers. They are former New South Wales Liberal leader and Managing Director of Government Relations firm Barton Deakin, Peter Collins, welcome, and Research Director at the Social Policy Research Centre at the University of New South Wales, Sarah Maddison. Thank you both so much for coming in this morning. Firstly, to the WikiLeaks saga, which we've been hearing about this morning. The website once again published secret documents, this time 250,000 diplomatic cables. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is a wanted man. Let's first listen to what's been said about the leaks in the past few days.
I absolutely condemn the placement of this information on the WikiLeaks website. It's a grossly irresponsible thing to do and an illegal thing to do.
Some governments deal with us because they fear us, some because they respect us, most because they need us. We are still essentially, as has been said before, the indispensable nation. So other nations will continue to deal with us. They will continue to work with us. We will continue to share sensitive information with one another. Is this embarrassing? Yes. Is it awkward? Yes. Consequences for U.S. foreign policy? I think fairly modest.
Organizations can either be efficient, open and honest, or they can be closed, conspiratorial and inefficient.
There we go. Well, Peter Collins, you were once part of a parliament and you would have probably debated issues like this in your time. Some US politicians have said it's far beyond free speech. How do you see it?
Well, I can understand exactly how they feel. The Americans must be wishing that Julian Assange had access to Russian intelligence, Chinese intelligence, and could hack and leak that as well. I mean, it's a very one-sided leak. That's their problem. Of course, governments collect this sort of information. The really interesting thing, I guess, for anyone is to look for the inconsistencies, to look at where a national leader says something which is the exact opposite of the intelligence which is gathered. And I suppose the example is weapons of mass destruction.
But there hasn't, from what I've read of these documents, there's been quite a few embarrassments, people saying what they really think behind the scenes, but there's been nothing major really, has there?
There's been nothing so far catastrophic, but I guess the Americans very rightly fear that if this continues, it's obviously going to compromise their own intelligence gathering, and I say that in the broadest sense: State Department, Department of Defense, CIA. It's going to make their intelligence gathering that much harder, and it will cause some permanent scars, I would think.
Sarah Maddison, there's been a lot of criticism of organisations such as the New York Times who've actually published some of these documents and added explanations to these documents. Do you think the outrage aimed at media organisations is fair?
Well, I think it's a bit ridiculous, really, and I think the fact that these documents have been published on a website indicates that the media age has well and truly moved on. The fact that this information is out there, it's available to anyone who cares to click on the WikiLeaks site, although I noticed that the American service providers are making that very difficult and they've just had to relocate to Switzerland. But to suggest that traditional forms of media shouldn't be reporting on that, I think is just ludicrous.
What about if there was some request to the Australian Attorney-General to try and somehow silence Australian media? How do you think that would go down?
Look, I tend to agree. If you can access this information on the internet, it's out there. Therefore, it is virtually impossible to stop the media. If the Australian government was asked to somehow intervene, it's hard to see how it could in the current circumstances. I guess, though, the net is closing on Julian Assange. I mean, that's the clear message that all the news stories are giving us, and he must be a very worried man.
The net is certainly closing on him. Again, is that fair given the fact that he's wanted on specific charges in Sweden? Prosecutors have refused to talk to him. What about the espionage charges, though? No one's actually served anything on him at the moment. Sarah Maddison.
Well, I don't think there have been, we've just seen Julia Gillard declare these illegal. I think the legality or otherwise of these is still very much open for question. The timing of the criminal charges is quite extraordinarily coincidental, wouldn't you say? One wonders what other kinds of espionage may or may not have gone on there, but I wouldn't like to be Julian Assange right now. The knock on the door is inevitably going to come. I would suggest he's at great risk in a number of ways.
And as the Australian government seems pretty hands-off, no one is actually saying, don't touch our citizen, are they?
I don't hear that at all. There is a deafening silence there, and I think that Julian Assange is going to be left to fight his own fight.
Okay. Well, the new Victorian Premier Ted Baillieu has been sworn in after the Brumby government's defeat last weekend. Let's first hear from the new Premier.
Accountability and transparency will be the principles that underpin our government. And the government that we lead will be driven by integrity and govern with dignity and decency.
That's Ted Baillieu. Sarah Maddison, what does this election result say of what's happening around the country with Labor governments?
Well, I think there's two levels at which we need to understand that. It's actually not unusual, in fact it tends to be par for the course, that when one party is in power federally, we see the state governments slowly flip over to the other side. And I think that's a really interesting part of Australia's federalism and the way Australian voters respond to our federalism, in that we see it as a useful check and balance to not have one party in power in all jurisdictions. I think that the previous Victorian government was not a bad government. I think there is some reflection on some dissatisfaction with Labor federally, and we're all bracing ourselves for the bloodbath that will be the New South Wales election in March.
I wonder whether Peter Collins agrees with you in terms of the previous Labor government in Victoria not being such a bad one.
I think probably the two best performing governments of the current batch at a state level have been Western Australia and Victoria over the last couple of years. But Victoria had 11 years on the clock, and I think it had run its political cycle. And part of the decision was not wanting to go down the path of New South Wales and trying to tack on one more term, where Victorians must look at the consequences in New South Wales and say that's not for us.
Okay, let's move on. We couldn't leave without mentioning the loss of our World Cup bid this week. There's been a strong reaction to the loss, but it's the videos that I want to discuss. Let's first look at part of Australia's bid video.
Hand it over. You've had your fun. I'm taking it back to FIFA.
Peter Collins. Look, we have a value proposition in this country, I think the ad men call it. Why do we always have to sell ourselves using kangaroos and celebrities?
I really think we should move on from that. Been there, done that about 30 years ago, and it really is time that we showed that Australia is a more complex and sophisticated place than this ad shows. It really is, it's a throwback.
Sarah Maddison?
If that video got us even one vote, then Struth, that was bloody lucky, wasn't it? Because it's atrocious. And I feel terribly sorry for Mr. Lowy and all the effort and the passion that he's put into this. But if $45 million buys us a film like that, we should really question the value of that public investment.
And one vote. $45 million got us one vote. I mean, I think this is going to be a tough process. And I agree with Sarah that Frank Lowy and the bid team put in a tremendous effort. But I think we've got a long way to go. It was a very surprising decision.
Do we need to think about the way we sell ourselves, though, since we've had a sort of recurring theme with the tourism videos? We just don't seem to be able to say what we're really about, do we?
I think it's got to be more than beaches and koala bears and shrimps on barbies. It really is time that we showed that Australia is a more sophisticated place, and that you've got some complexity. It's not just about going to the beach when you come to Australia.
I mean, I would argue that there's a deeper level to that as a nation we're still really uncertain about who we are. We haven't managed to reconcile our origins with the Indigenous peoples of this country. It leaves us confused and unable to express in a serious way who we are as a nation.
Great story to tell, but nobody's telling it.
Okay, fair enough. Good point. Peter Collins, Sarah Maddison, thanks so much for joining us. And do stay tuned. Don't go away. We'll be back at the top of the hour with more headlines.